Hello and welcome to another segment of DSU Inside Perspective. I'm Carlos Holmes, and this is the show where we talk with faculty, administrators, students, alumni, and folks from the outside about things that are going on in the world and some of the great things that are going on here at Delaware State University. On April 3rd, Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis, Tennessee in support of the sanitation workers' strike. He gave his final speech that night at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis. This is an excerpt of what he said.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
On the very next day, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated shortly after 6 p.m. that evening at the Lorraine Motel as he stood on the balcony. Today, or this week, we are celebrating Martin Luther King by remembering the 50th anniversary of his death. And today I have with me Dr. Donald Blakey, who is not only an alumnus of Delaware State University, class of 1958, but he was a faculty member at then Delaware State College on that fateful day in 1968. Don, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure, Carlos.
When Martin Luther King was assassinated on that day, and this was about 6 o'clock in the evening when it actually happened, how long did it take folks on campus to figure out what was going on?
Well, Carlos, I do believe that it took quite a little time for the information to filter down to the students and also faculty, any other person on campus, because of the fact of the nature of the beast at that time.
The media beast.
The media beast. There were only 3 television stations that we could listen to, all from Philadelphia. There was one radio station here in Dover, no television stations. Salisbury did not have anything, so information was very slow coming to us. At the same time, you're talking about a time of the year when most people are outside. This is spring. April the 4th is, they're playing baseball. We played baseball during that particular time of year. So many of the students were out on the campus and faculty were doing things. They were out watching the games and also just walking about and things of that nature. Secondarily, in the dormitories, there was not this plethora of television sets. Each dormitory had a television set, one television set, no radios in the rooms, no cell phones that you could listen to all day and all night. So you were limited to what you could get when you could get it. And then you had to determine whether or not you believed it. So when that event occurred, obviously it stirred the emotions of people, but they still could not digest it until a number of hours had gone by, and maybe the next day or the next day after that.
Once it became clear that the information finally came through, and it might have been the next day, the way news ran back in those days, first of all, what was your personal reaction to the news that Martin Luther King had been assassinated?
Well, let me say it's a two-sided coin in that regard. I was appalled that his life had been taken, but I wasn't surprised. Because if you remember, during that particular period, we lost John F. Kennedy, and later on we lost his brother.
Bobby Kennedy.
We lost, who else was there? Malcolm X, Medgar Evers. I mean, this was a continuum. So it's hard to take, but not a surprise.
And he had also suffered an assassination attempt in 1958 where a woman tried to stab him.
Stab him, right.
The students, you know, faculty lament today that students do not keep up on current events as well as they would like them to, okay? Back then, did the students understand who Martin Luther King was and you know, his life and legacy in connection with the civil rights movement?
Not like today. At that particular time, you remember now that he had a foil, and his foil was, I'm trying to think of his name right now, from New York.
Ralph Aberdeen?
No, Malcolm X.
Oh, Malcolm X. Okay.
Yeah, Malcolm X was his foil. You had a faction on the campus that believed wholeheartedly in what Malcolm X was all about. And you had a faction on the campus who believed wholeheartedly in what Martin Luther King was all about.
Even now, that was 3 years after Malcolm X was assassinated.
That's correct.
But his message was still going strong.
His message was still going strong, very strong. Right.
You know, the assassination sparked rioting in a lot of urban cities across the country, even nearby in Wilmington and in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia. Did anything like that happen in Dover, Delaware?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
And I think I would have been aware of that because, I mean, obviously I lived in Dover. Mm-hmm. But I did, say, encounter Wilmington, things happening in Wilmington. My mother-in-law lived in Wilmington, so I had to go there. So we saw all of the activities that took place there. Washington, D.C.
What did you see in Wilmington?
There were people who were really upset over what had taken place and say standing on the corner or preaching and doing whatever it was to exclaim and filter the loss of Martin Luther King. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I saw it take place right around the corner from Howard University. With all of the destruction of all of the businesses that took place at that time in that location, which have been rebuilt now.
At then Delaware State College, did we have a memorial service?
I don't remember that. I don't remember. I'm more than likely, I'm almost positive that we did, basically because of the fact of fraternal life. Martin Luther King was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and we had a plethora of faculty members and students on campus who were members of Alpha Phi Alpha. And all of the fraternities at that time, which I'm not quite sure how they operate today, were supportive.
Wasn't the president of Delaware State College at the time, Dr. Luna Mashu, wasn't he an Alpha?
He was an Alpha.
Okay.
He was an Alpha, right. Dr. Washington was an Alpha. Who
Dr.
else?
Ulysses Washington.
Ulysses Washington was an Alpha. Mr. Franklin was an Alpha. Mr. Pinkett was an Alpha. He was the businessman that sort of got us out of Dutch. There were a number of Alphas on campus, as well as other fraternities. So, but it was his fraternity, and they revered him as did others revere him. But they had a fraternal responsibility, and that is to make sure that Martin Luther King is remembered. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure that they had activities that invited people in to, well, let their feelings be known.
Mm-hmm. This is 50 years later.
That's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago. But having said that, we have learned much over the years, not only about what Martin Luther King did during his life, but the impact of his life and legacy. For you, what is the takeaway from the life and legacy of Martin Luther King?
I particularly like this peaceful means of getting problems solved. And at the same time, I don't think you could put him in a box and say that he should stay with civil rights, because you know he veered off into the Vietnam War, which was a big problem for him. And people today there are people today living that protested the Vietnam War as he did. Mm-hmm. And so in the words of a song, war is not the answer. I mean, that was one of his credos, and I mean, I appreciated that. Today, war is not the answer.
And as he came towards the end of his life, he was not only taking up the mantle of civil rights, but he was also protesting the Vietnam War at the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, because he did that, he was denigrated. I mean, he was not in this lofty place that we have him today. I mean, this is a recent occurrence. Mm-hmm. It took 10 years after his death for him to be elevated to the position that he holds today. He was growing older. He wasn't an old man, but he was growing older, and people thought he was getting outside of his bailiwick. Mm-hmm. And so he was losing some credibility. Mm-hmm. But he was steadfast in what he believed. That's the most important part. He was very steadfast in what he believed. That's a lesson. Right. That's a lesson, you know.
Well, Don, I really appreciate you coming here and sharing. As I was trying to think of people that might have been here in 1968, I realized that, boy, that's a long time ago. And there's very few, and you're retired from teaching.
Absolutely, I'm retired from everything.
But you're still around, and I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your remembrances of that fateful day and the impact of Martin Luther King. And thank you for joining us for this recognition and remembrance of April 4th, 50 years ago, the assassination of Martin Luther King. Thank you for joining me here, DSU Inside Perspective. Everyone have a good day.